What up, TCK Podders? Welcome back to the TCK Pod right here on the YouTube channel. We have our mini series continuing. Bob and I are breaking down some recaps from the 2021 wide receiver busts for fantasy football. We covered Calvin Ridley in a previous video. This video, we're talking about DK Metcalf. We got a couple other guys coming up in our mini series, so stay tuned for that right here on the Fantasy Focused YouTube channel for a longer, more in-depth, bigger list of players episode. Make sure you tune in to our podcast anywhere the Believe podcast networks are found. That's the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. We have one episode per week these days, but you can catch all these mini series a couple times a week right here on the YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook channels as well. Once again, we are breaking down DK Metcalf in a review of last year, a preview of 2022. Bob, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, as you know, we're going to talk a little bit about his positional ADP last year was 5.5, basically on average amongst the sites we polled. The overall finish was 19th at the position, which is really not good. And he was also points per game 20th. So DK is a very odd when you're looking at his actual. I'm sorry, I just messed this up. Overall 19th was his ADP. ADP positional was 5.5. He finished points per game 20th at the position on the year. Overall finish at the position was 12th. So he did finish as a back-end wide receiver one, but DK played 17 games, which always helps. But on a points per game basis, he's about 15 points positions behind where he was drafted on average. So that's why we're talking about DK today. And I'll admit, this is the first one I ran into some issues trying to figure out why he was a bust. And it's really... He had 12 touchdowns. I mean, you look at that, you're like, okay, it's still DK. He gets the end zone, so that's not the problem. And that's been most of the themes, right? Guys just had bad touchdown regression or progression, been a huge part. So it made me kind of dive a little bit deeper. Really, the biggest blemish on his resume was his yardage. He was under 1,000 yards after having a monster 2020 season. That's even yards per target, yards per reception, all down. So that's really where the driver came from. So when I started looking at that, the first thing was the overall passing attempts went down. So in 2020, the Seattle Seahawks threw the ball 35.2 times per game. That dropped to 29.1. So they lost about 6 attempts per game. That's actually going to impact people. That's why even in one additional game, DK had the same exact targets on the year. So that doesn't help, but that's really shouldn't have cratered him that much. So then when you dive into it, I thought maybe it's because Russell missed some time. That's not it. With Russell Wilson, in the games he played 11.5 points per game. In the games without Russell Wilson, 17.2. So he had those big games with Gino. It was Tyler Lockett that got impacted more by that. So that was interesting. So I wanted to take a look at it. One area it did show was his deep passing numbers. He lost about 4 receptions, 200 yards, and a touchdown in a deep passing game from the prior year. But that's still about half of his overall yardage. So it is something that maybe there was some with the new offensive scheme, which we bring this up all the time, system continuity. Shane Waldron comes in from the Rams. He brings in a new system, that West Coast style. So it was something different. So there was some learning curve there for that deep offense. Maybe it's a timing thing because they did lose about 14% accuracy on deep balls between him and Russ. So that's important to note as well. But DK was still pretty solid. He still had elite performances. So he was 11th in elite game percentage. That's 18 points per game. That's 4 games of the season. But then when you start looking at his consistency, wide receiver 1 games, he falls all the way to 20th in that metric, only 7 of his games. And the worst part, too, is he only finished with double-digit fantasy points in 8 games. Him and Tyreek Hill are the only 2 players in the top 24 that actually had more games under 10 points per game than they actually did hit double digits. So that's huge. So he was 29th in that metric. So that's a little alarming. But overall, what's your thoughts, Sky, on his 2022 outlook? I think the second-year leap is going to happen. But if Russell stays and they still have Lockett in him, what's your thoughts about DK's bounce-back potential?
Of course, so much of this has to do with Russell Wilson. And let's assume he does come back. Again, it's kind of the tale of 2 seasons within the season for DK Metcalf the last 2 years, and Tyler Lockett as well. Last year, if we cycle back a little bit to the previous year, one of the reasons I was so fired up on him was because he was the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy points per game behind only Devontae Adams over weeks 1 through 9 last year. But in the second half, weeks 10 through 17. Last year, he was wide receiver 23 overall and wide receiver 39 in points per game. Similar situation this year, Bob, which you alluded to. So can we get DK Metcalf / Tyler Lockett to just be studs the entire season? Of course, Russ goes down this year, changes things a little bit. Now, basic wide receiver metrics I look at all the time for, predictions and how we can look ahead on these guys. I immediately look at targets. DK was 12th in targets. And actually that kind of surprised me, only because you don't think of him as a big reception guy. You think of him as, a big play guy, but 12 targets, even with Geno Smith involved in things. Lockett was 22nd in one less game. So if you give Lockett, let's say, about 9 targets per game, that's going to put him up in, maybe the 18 range. So you got 2 wide receivers within the top 20 for targets. Now, DK did have 12 touchdowns, but he had 9 games with less than 60 receiving yards. That's going to crater your week. That's going to absolutely destroy you if you're looking for that. So touchdowns have gone up each of the last 3 seasons with DK. He's had at least 129 targets in back-to-back seasons. He had 100 as a rookie as well. The big question is going to be what's up with Russell Wilson. So if I look ahead at this year, I think Russ does come back. If Russ does come back, I'm worried about Chris Carson. Your boy Rashad Penny's a beast, but are they really going to trust the run game enough? Pete Carroll, I think, is on his way out the door. I think sooner than next year, but potentially next year. And I think Russ wants to really make sure that he gets the most done. So when Russ airs it out, the Seahawks are successful. Fantasy football is amazing. I think they're going to try that this year. They tried a little bit 2 years ago. It came back. If we can let DK loose, I think we're going to be just fine. I'm still all in on DK. Last year, he was in my top 5. I had Calvin Ridley up there as well, which I mentioned to on the last episode. I can't have DK that high again this year. But I don't think it's not a DK issue. It's just he needs to get those targets. He needs to, the biggest issue, Bob, we look at the second half of the season and talk about those big games when he had, let me dial it up here real quick in the second half, because I want to make sure that we get this correct. I had my player comp up, which I'll bring that up in just a second. So if we go to his games here, he had, let's see, 1 touchdown, 0, 1, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2 over the first 8 games. Absolutely crushing it. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 touchdowns in the first 8 games. Then they had the bye week in week 9. Of course, Russ is hurt in the middle of this. He did not score again until week 16, but he scored 3 touchdowns in your fantasy football championship. So not the huge games, not the big 100-yard games that you're looking for in fantasy for consistency, but of course he has the ability to take the top off at any given time. So I'm still all in on DK Metcalf. I'm going to be drafting him probably at a value this year. Tyler Lockett remains to be amazing, and as long as Russ is there, they have a great rapport. It is actually surprising to realize that DK Metcalf had more targets than Tyler Lockett and more touchdowns, but Lockett had more yardage. So those big plays are still going to Lockett, but of course DK is that red zone threat there. So as long as Russ comes back, man, I'm still in on both these guys.
Yeah, early best ball ADP has him at 23rd overall. So it doesn't really seem like he's fallen much, but maybe a couple spots.
Well, and I think this is something I don't want to go into here too much because we're trying to keep these episodes a little more condensed on purpose, but something you and I and the team are going to dive into throughout the summer here as we get ready for draft season is like, we talk a lot about recency bias in fantasy football for better or worse. A guy like DK Metcalf, who scored 3 touchdowns in your fantasy championship and probably won you that week, unless you went up against, Jamar Chase or Cooper Kupp or whatever else on a huge game, that is going to stick with people. And they're going to say, look, I could get that every week going to next year. You got to obviously level that off a little bit. So maybe his ADP won't drop as much. But when it comes push to shove, there's a lot of other stud wide receivers that might jump DK. Obviously, if Russ leaves, we're going to have a whole new conversation for 2022. But assuming Russ comes back, I'm still all in on DK. But, I'm not going to draft him in the second round. I'll tell you right now.
So the good thing about PFF, what they do is they actually take out the non-catchable targets. So the craziest part about DK, if you compare 2020 to 2021, he had the same exact targets, 124. But the weirdest part is he drops from 83 receptions in 2020 to 75 in 2021. But his yardage, 1,300 yards down to 967. He actually had 2 more touchdowns this year, but he cratered in the receiving game so much. But the biggest difference, and listen, when I say 6 the difference between 6 attempts a game, it doesn't sound like a lot. But when you pull that out for 17 games, he ran 499 routes in 2021. He ran 631
It's amazing.
in 2020. That is ridiculous. That volume. So I talk about this all the time, and I do my opportunity analysis, which I actually look at career dropbacks. And I'm actually really interested to see if Shane Waldron's ties to Sean McVay, what the actual average is for them, because I have a feeling that that's going to bounce back. And when you look at that, think about this. It doesn't sound like a lot right now, but targets per route run is a very unique metric. I've heard this a couple times, and I can't remember the guy who did the analysis. But think about this. The same exact targets, 124, but he ran nearly 140 less routes. So he's getting targeted on his routes more. So imagine what can happen if he goes back to that 630, 600 range, and now he's being targeted more on those routes. Now he could be in the 150 range. Now we're talking. So that's what I like about 2021. But did you give us your potential guy for 2022? Maybe someone that could take a step back similarly?
Yeah, and this is interesting because this is a player that, first of all, in the same draft class, and I think he could either explode like we expected DK to explode last year, but he could also take another step back if the quarterback situation doesn't get fixed in Washington, similar to Seattle. And a player comp for me right now, both positively and negatively for DK Metcalf, is Terry McLaurin. So if you look at Terry McLaurin last year, played 17 games, 175 fantasy points in half PPR, right? He had 10 per week, not bad. Average finish was 34, which is pretty rough. He had some boomer bust games, but like DK, he finished 10 points behind his ADP. All right. Now, the thing with Terry McLaurin is obviously the quarterback thing is an issue. He hasn't had a quality quarterback for consistency. I like Taylor Heineke for a general NFL quarterback, but not for fantasy bombs, right? So if we can get Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf type usage, this kid is equally as talented, right? Different type of receiver, but incredible wide receiver, route runner, great hands, the whole thing. And the second half of the season crushed people that had Terry McLaurin. In the first half, he had 4 touchdowns, not bad. He finished top 3 against your Giants in week 2, unfortunately. Finished number 4 against Atlanta, number 5 against Green Bay. Then they had the bye week, finished number 9 against Carolina. But listen to this to round out the year, Bob. Week 12 on. This is in PPR leagues. Wide receiver 42, 56, 109.
109.
Catchless against Dallas. 53, 65, 30, and 35. Obviously unacceptable. So this is another situation. Like anybody that brings up DK Metcalf, you're never going to say DK is the problem. He's not. And Russell Wilson is a borderline Hall of Famer when it's all said and done. So obviously that's not the issue there. It's play calling, it's Pete Carroll, it's running too much, it's Seattle football, whatever. Terry McLaurin just hasn't had the quarterback yet. When like DJ Moore, same thing. These guys get the quarterback. I think they're both going to explode, and they're already very good. They're just we're wanting more than we're able to get because of the quarterback so far with Terry McLaurin and DJ Moore. Terry McLaurin in particular, I think, can take that next elite step. But unfortunately, if we don't fix the quarterback position, I think he can also fall again short of expectations. So far for me, for better and worse, my player comp right now for DK Metcalf is Terry McLaurin.
So I brought this up earlier. It's Justin Jefferson because of the lack of continuity, change in offensive scheme. But Jefferson's going 7th overall in early best ball 10 ADP. That's a little too rich for my blood. I think he does no Adam Thielen this year either, so that might be something worth knowing. Well, that's another episode of how to avoid drafting a bust in your fantasy drafts. This time we broke down DK Metcalf. Make sure you're checking us out tomorrow. We're going to do a full breakdown of our entire list on this episode. But once again, I'm Bobby Lamarco. All our episodes are brought to you by BetOnline AG and on the Believe Podcast Network. Make sure you shout out to our fantasy-focused friends on the YouTube side. I'm Bob. That's Sky. We are out of here.